The Good Old Wasteland, published in 1922 by T.S. Eliot, the famous and some would say infamous modernist epic. In many ways, this will be the hardest thing that we read in this entire course. But it's not necessarily because the language itself is confounding, it's just the structure which gives people problems. This poem has a long history of making graduate students in literature tremble in fear just because there's so much going on. It has countless allusions to other things. It speaks in multiple languages, of course, that is something difficult. It's constantly referring to other texts, other things in history, things in popular culture, things in, the past literature. It shifts constantly, it changes place, it changes location, it changes speakers, it's in a lot of different voices, and in many ways it sort of acts as a collage. A collage in art, of course, is when you take a whole bunch of things and you put them together on one canvas, and by virtue of them all being on that one canvas, they have a conversation with each other, even though at face value they might not necessarily have a whole lot in common. That's sort of like what the Wasteland is doing. One thing that you should know is that the original version of this complicated poem was actually twice as long, but over the course of years, and with the help of other poet Ezra Pound, it was, who, as you notice, the poem is actually dedicated to. The poem was trimmed and cut and minimized until we have just this little bit that we have now. This poem has a number of incredibly famous lines in it, including, of course, the beginning, "April is the cruelest month." And then also, "I will show you fear in a handful of dust." That's a really fantastic line, of course, harkening back to the whole issue of death and dust to dust, and the whole entire notion that showing somebody fear in a handful of dust is the idea that mortality is always just around the bend. Of course, the very end of the poem, "Shanti, Shanti, Shanti," is also very famous, and is yet another thing that for somebody who, is not familiar with the language that is in, would find difficult. That phrase actually means the peace which passeth understanding. So it gets back to the idea of ending with some sort of peace. In many ways, this complicated poem, it's about a lot of different things, but one of the big things that it touches on is the spiritual malaise of our lives, of industry, of the city, of trying to find our way in the world and sort of falling short, feeling a little bit adrift, feeling like the empires, both of our cities and of our lives, are falling apart and not necessarily getting where they need to get. It also discusses a lot in regards to the issue of class, such as the lay speech, the common speech at the end of part 2, which actually takes place in a bar. That's why it keeps saying, "Hurry up." That's the bartender telling them that it's going to close. Versus the high language and things not even in English that you find elsewhere in the poem. Again, it's just sort of a collage, and a lot of times if there's a shift or something doesn't make any sense at all, it's because we're actually in a different circumstance. One thing that can help you work your way through all this, because it is, a monumentally complicated poem, is that there's actually a website. So go ahead and look right there at the bottom of the screen, and that website, I implore you to go visit that site, and it actually goes through the entire poem. It just has the poem there on the page, and it highlights certain sections, and it tells you specifically what they mean. So all the parts that are in foreign languages, it breaks those things down for you. All the parts where it maybe is making an allusion to something, it breaks it down, such as even the instance where he mentions the Shakespearean rag. That's a reference to a thing that was going on. So that's a page that you're definitely going to want to visit and spend a little bit of time. Just, for your own edification, just sort of going through and looking through it and clicking on various things and sort of seeing what all of it means. Because in many ways, the reason why this is a famous modernist text is because it is elite and labor intensive. We've left behind the sort of great democracy and hopefulness of Whitman, and we've come up to something entirely new now. This is the 20th century now. We've changed our mode of thinking, and now it's about things like money and industry and individualism and labor and intellect, and all these sort of things have sort of changed the name of the game a little bit for Americans. T.S. Eliot himself actually eventually left America and became a British citizen and joined the Anglican Church. So there's something to be said there, but you can come to your own conclusions. But definitely check out that site. You'll be amazed, and it really will increase your appreciation of this most profound and complicated work. Some other things that are relevant in regards to it is that, of course, it's broken into these 5 sections: the burial of the dead, the game of chess, the fire sermon, death by water, and what the thunder said. In each of these 5 sections, he uses various examples to make his case. He also constantly refers to the idea of the unreal city, or unreal, and pictures people mindlessly crossing the bridge, people with their eyes downcast, people who are, sort of failing to recognize the truth, people who are talking about, in one spot there's a woman who is, being told by a friend that when her significant other gets back from the war, he's going to leave her for another woman unless she goes and gets some new teeth, because apparently her teeth are bad. So this sort of like fickleness, this idea of like vacationing and all of these other sort of things, Eliot sees as examples of the degradation of society. And of course, in part 5, he refers to the falling towers, all these cities falling: Alexandria, Athens, and of course we have London on that list as an example of a city that was once a great empire but is now fallen. And at the end of section 5, he says London Bridge is falling down. He also says these fragments I've shored against my ruins. So all of this amounts to and brings us to the very end of the poem, where he says Data Dayadvam Damyata Shanti Shanti Shanti, which means, from the Upanishads, which is a great Hindu text, give, sympathize, control, the peace which passeth understanding. So there have been a lot of different interpretations of this, and Eliot during his lifetime was reluctant to, spell this out too clearly for us, even though he does give us some help. But one thing that you can say there is that there is a way out of this spiritual malaise, and it's by returning to a notion of religion, because, of course, Eliot himself reinvested in his life in religion. You also may have noticed that there are notes at the end of this poem. It was originally published without those notes, but the publisher, to make the book a little bit thicker, wanted them added. So Eliot wrote these notes, and some people have actually spoken down on him for including notes to his own poem, but of course the notes in some ways make things more complicated rather than less. And years later, Eliot lamented having to put the notes on there, saying that it sent people on a wild goose chase after tarot cards and the Holy Grail. But in many ways, that's just sort of the nature of a collage-oriented modernist piece of literature. You have to work at it. You have to take your time with it. It's going to be confusing. But if you invest that time, if you study the allusions, there is a lot of stuff to be intellectually gained from the study.